I grew up in a 3-bedroom house in Central Texas where the thermostat and the pecking order were both set by my mother. Charlotte, my older sister by 2 years, never had to ask for praise. It came to her like mail on a Monday. I learned to read the room and keep my victories quiet. If Charlotte brought home an A, Mom framed the report card. If I shaved 2 minutes off my mile time, Mom asked if I was done running around like a boy. Dad, a numbers guy from a regional bank, tried to stay neutral. Neutral looked a lot like silence. At school, I liked order, checklists, and anything with a clear standard. Track practice made sense. You show up, you work, you stop the clock. Debate team felt like a performance review you could win by breathing correctly. Charlotte loved it. By sophomore year, she was already talking about law school. I was comparing notes with the JROTC instructor about logistics, how to move people and supplies, how to plan under pressure, why small failures multiply if you don't fix them early. That sounded like a life. Mom said it sounded like a phase. The running joke used mostly by Charlotte was that I was the son Dad never had. It wasn't said like a compliment. If I helped Dad change the oil, Mom would stage whisper about grease under fingernails and what boys notice. If Charlotte walked in wearing a blazer, Mom called her my little attorney. I kept a straight face and filed it away. People tell you who they are when they think they're winning. People tell you who they think you are when they think you're stuck. Sunday dinners were the family's weekly performance review. Mom cooked a pot roast, Dad carved, and Charlotte delivered speeches about her AP classes, Model UN awards, and the mock trial coach's adoration. When conversation turned to me, it was always a soft landing. Victoria did track, said like an appointment you can't reschedule. That night we had relatives visiting, so the audience was bigger. Charlotte described a summer law program at Columbia as if the admissions committee had personally begged her. Mom nodded along. Then she turned to me. What are your summer plans, sweetheart? Maybe something more too feminine? Your aunt knows a boutique in Austin that needs part-time help. End quote. I'm planning to enroll in the DROTC leadership seminar, I said. And Coach wants me to help set up logistics for the regional meet. I've been reading about supply chains. The Army has... Mom's fork paused in the air. The Army is not a career. It's something boys do before they get serious. Dad cleared his throat like he'd found a pebble in the gravy. There are careers in the Army, Helen. Charlotte smiled the way you smile at a dog wearing sunglasses. Vic wants to play soldier. It's cute. It's not playing, I said. There are units that plan transport, medical supplies, cold storage, convoy timing. It's math and planning. It fits me. Mom set the fork down and folded her napkin with the care you give to a form you're about to reject. It does not fit this family. The part that stung wasn't the sentence. It was the certainty. Mom had already decided which daughters fit, which paths counted. I felt Dad watching me, wanting a diplomatic exit. I didn't take it. I'm meeting the DROC instructor tomorrow to talk about applying to the summer course, I said. It leads to real training down the line. I want that. Down the line? Charlotte said. Like boot camp? Are you planning to shave your head too? Dad said my name, a quiet warning. I let it go because I knew a better place to argue. Practice. I ran that night until my legs stopped reporting pain and started sending data. Distance, time, splits. The numbers didn't care if I wore a blazer or grease. They cared if I showed up. At school the next day, Master Sergeant Ellis handed me a printout about an Army logistics career path most people never discuss at career day. You're organized, he said. You don't get rattled. That's 90% of moving things on time. The other 10% is learning not to trust the first plan. I can do that, I said. You'll also have to get used to people who think they understand your job because they saw a movie, he added. Smile, do the job, keep receipts. At home, I put the brochure on the kitchen counter. Mom moved it to the junk drawer like it was a mailer for discount tires. Charlotte breezed in with a stack of printouts about internships and asked where the cute gray blazer had gone. Mom said she'd already dry cleaned it for her law firm tour. I rinsed my hands and made a sandwich with military precision. 2 weeks later, the school held awards night. Charlotte collected enough certificates to make a breeze when she turned back to wave. I got a plaque for Outstanding DROTC Cadet, which sounded to Mom like an extracurricular with extra laundry. When we took photos, the principal put Charlotte in the center. He put me next to the guy adjusting the banner. It was a good photo. It told the truth about our house. By early summer, while Charlotte flew to New York for her program complete with airport photos and captions about learning the language of power, I attended the JROTC leadership course in San Antonio. We did drills in heat that made your teeth sweat, learned how to stage vehicles, how to count backwards from failure into success. The instructors talked about redundancy like a love language. 2 is 1, 1 is none. I didn't feel tough. I felt useful. I called home once a week. Dad asked if I was eating enough, then apologized for asking. Mom asked if I'd met any nice boys with a plan for civilian life. Charlotte texted me a photo of a conference room with the caption, "Real meetings." I sent her a picture of a whiteboard full of supply routes and time hacks, labeled in dry erase pen. She didn't respond. I didn't need her to. When I got back, Sunday dinner was waiting with the same script and a few new punchlines. Charlotte had learned to say securities regulation in a way that sounded like a yacht. Mom announced that Charlotte's mentor knew a senator's aide. Dad asked how my course went. I told them I'd been recommended for advanced training after graduation and that Master Sergeant Ellis wanted me to help plan the fall field exercise. Mom buttered a roll like she was doing triage. "You can help with your cousin's wedding shower instead," she said. "We need centerpieces, not 2 field exercises." 1. "Those aren't mutually exclusive," I said. "But the exercise is on the same weekend." Charlotte tapped her glass with her fork. "She can't, Mom. She'll be too busy playing Army." "Charlotte," Dad said, sharper than usual. "It's fine," I said. "I'll make time for what matters." I meant it. I also knew the definition of matters changes at altitude. After dinner, I offered to do the dishes. Dad dried, and for a minute the kitchen belonged to people who knew when to talk. "You're good at this," he said. "Planning. Executing. I see it." "Thanks. Your mother wants safe. She thinks safe looks like what she understands." "I know." He nodded toward the dining room where Charlotte was telling Aunt Diane about summer in New York. "Your sister thinks praise is a resource you can hoard. She'll figure it out. Maybe." That night I laid out my running shoes, my binder with tabs, and the brochure Mom kept returning to the junk drawer. The house was quiet. Approval wasn't coming, not in the way Charlotte got it. I understood logistics. Move what you have, not what you wish you had. I had work ethic, clarity under pressure, and a map. I also had a family that treated my path like a detour. Fine. A detour still gets you there if you know the roads. In the morning, I ran my usual loop past the water tower and the football field where Charlotte would later wave from a homecoming float in a sash. I didn't picture a float. I pictured a convoy schedule that didn't slip, pallets arriving before they were missed, people safe because details were right. When I got home, I found Mom at the counter with a stack of catalogs for Charlotte's dorm shopping. She didn't look up when I poured coffee. "I'm meeting Master Sergeant Ellis again after lunch," I said. "He wants me to help with inventory planning for the ROTC supplies." Mom circled a lamp with a free shipping code. "Make sure you're back by 5. Charlotte needs help choosing outfits for her law firm visit." "I've got the planning session until 6, I said. "I'll be back after." She didn't argue. She didn't agree. She flipped a page. I took my coffee and my binder and headed for the door, passing the hall where family photos hung in polite order. Charlotte's awards had their own collage. My track medals were in a shadow box Dad claimed he still hadn't found the right spot for. He would. He kept receipts. I did too, just different kinds. Outside, the heat came on fast, and the day moved the way good plans do when you stop asking permission and start. The heat from the pavement was still clinging to my shoes when I walked into the recruiter's office. The place smelled like toner and determination, with a wall of posters showing people in uniforms looking like they'd figured life out. I wasn't fooled by glossy photos, but I knew what I wanted. The recruiter, a staff sergeant with a buzz cut sharp enough to file paperwork, slid a packet across the desk. "You serious about this, Hayes?" he asked. "As serious as I've ever been," I said, taking the pen. At home, the paperwork was like a grenade on the kitchen table. Mom spotted it first. She read the top line, her face doing that thing where disapproval turned her cheeks into parentheses. "You're not signing this," she said. "I already did," I answered. Dad lowered the newspaper an inch, then 2. Charlotte came in from her internship, already in one of her tailored blazers, holding a briefcase she didn't need. "What's this?" she asked, peering over Mom's shoulder. Your sister thinks joining the army will make her somebody, Mom said, her voice dripping with the kind of sarcasm that corrodes steel. Charlotte's smile was immediate. Well, somebody has to carry the bags, right? Congrats, Vic. You're going to be a bellhop with dog tags. End quote. I'm going to be an officer, I said, calm but firm. There's a path for logistics, planning, transport, supply. That's the career. Mom snapped the folder shut. That's a phase. You're not throwing away your future for a uniform. It's not throwing away anything. It's building something you don't understand, I replied. Dad folded his newspaper and placed it neatly beside his coffee. Helen, she's not asking permission. She's telling us. Hass. Mom gave him a look that could have frozen tap water. Don't encourage this. I'm not encouraging, Dad said evenly. I'm acknowledging. Charlotte rolled her eyes. Oh, please. This is Vic we're talking about. She can't even pick a dress for prom without looking like she lost a bet. How's she going to run an army anything? I don't need a dress to do my job. I shot back. The room went quiet, except for Mom's heavy sigh. She slid the paperwork back to me like it was contaminated. If you walk out that door in uniform, don't expect this family to applaud. We don't celebrate mistakes. I took it, tucked it under my arm, and looked at Dad. He gave me the smallest nod, the kind you could miss if you weren't looking for it. It was enough. That night I packed a duffel bag. Not because I was leaving immediately, but because I needed to see my choice in physical form. Running shoes, a notebook, a photo of me and Dad at a baseball game years ago, my JROTC pin. Charlotte leaned on the doorway, arms crossed. You're really going through with this? She asked. Yes. You know Mom's never going to brag about you at Christmas. She already doesn't, I said. Charlotte smirked. Fair. Just don't embarrass us by quitting. I don't kid. The next morning, I showed up at the processing center. Fingerprints, medical checks, a barrage of questions designed to weed out anyone unsure. I wasn't unsure. The doctor tapped my knee with a rubber hammer. The counselor asked if I had family support. I said, enough. When the enlistment oath came, I repeated every word like I was etching it into steel. Around me, other recruits fidgeted, some grinning nervously. I just stood there, feeling the weight settle in my chest. A good weight, like a pack you've trained to carry. Training started 2 weeks later. The first days were a blur of shouting, sweat, and rules stacked on rules. I kept my head down and learned. Push-ups weren't the challenge. The challenge was attention to detail, knowing when to speak and when to keep quiet. Logistics isn't glamorous. It's not front-page combat, but every meal, every bullet, every piece of medical gear had to move because someone like me made a spreadsheet match reality. At night, lying on a cot in a room that smelled like boot polish and nerves, I thought about Mom probably telling neighbors that her older daughter was at Columbia while her younger daughter was figuring things out. I let the thought burn for a minute, then pushed it aside. Anger was fuel, but too much fuel at once sets fires you can't control. During a field exercise, we had to stage a mock supply drop. Most of the recruits treated it like a game, stacking boxes wherever they landed. I drew a quick grid, assigned positions, and timed the unloading. We finished 5 minutes ahead of schedule, with every box accounted for. The drill sergeant, who hadn't smiled in 3 days, gave me a sharp nod. That nod was worth more than all of Charlotte's blazers. Letters from home were sparse. Dad wrote once, a short note on bank stationery. Proud of you. Stay sharp. Mom sent nothing. Charlotte texted me a photo of her standing on the steps of a courthouse in Manhattan, captioned, Future partner. I didn't reply. Not because I couldn't, but because silence sometimes makes the louder point. One weekend, the base chaplain asked me why I looked so focused during downtime. I told him I didn't have the luxury of wasting this chance. He said most people join for college money or to escape something. I said I joined because I wanted to prove that my path wasn't a mistake. He nodded slowly, like he knew better than to argue with that. Graduation day from basic training was hot enough to melt ambition. Families filled the bleachers, waving flags and snapping photos. I scanned the crowd and found Dad, tie slightly crooked, clapping like he meant it. Mom wasn't there. Charlotte definitely wasn't. When my name was called, Dad stood up alone and whistled. It was the only sound I needed. After the ceremony, Dad shook my hand like I was a colleague, not just his kid. You made your choice, he said. Yeah. It looks good on you, he added, glancing at the uniform. For a second, I thought he might say more, something about pride or defiance, but he just patted my shoulder. Words weren't his thing. Numbers were. He'd already calculated the odds and decided I'd beat them. Back at the barracks, I folded the uniform carefully. It wasn't a costume. It wasn't a phase. It was the first tool in a kit I intended to build. I knew Mom would keep telling people her younger daughter was finding her way. Charlotte would keep saying I was playing soldier. Fine, let them. I had paperwork that said otherwise, boots that hurt for the right reasons, and a future that didn't require their permission. The next orders pinned me to my path, and I didn't flinch when they came. The desert dust clung to everything, and I could taste it before I even stepped off the transport plane. Iraq wasn't a postcard of war. It was logistics under a magnifying glass. Heat, distance, supply lines stretched so thin that a single bad decision could leave people hungry, unarmed, or unprotected. I wasn't a rookie anymore. I was an officer responsible for making sure trucks rolled, planes landed, and pallets showed up where they were supposed to. Our first convoy assignment looked straightforward: on paper move rations and medical kits to a forward operating base 3 hours away. The reality was that every mile carried risk. I spent the night before with maps spread across a folding table, double-checking convoy spacing, fuel stops, and alternate routes. The sergeant assigned to me, Morales, leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. Ma'am, we've been running this route for months. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. Wheels fall off when you stop checking the bolts, I said without looking up. He chuckled. Fair enough. All nay. The convoy rolled out at sunrise, a line of armored trucks that looked tougher than they really were. I rode in the second vehicle, headset on, eyes moving between the road and the notepad balanced on my knee. At the 20-mile mark, Morales tapped the radio. Possible obstruction ahead. Dust cloud, left side. I ordered the lead truck to slow. Seconds later, the road erupted. An improvised explosive, crude but effective, punched a crater into the asphalt. The blast threw shrapnel into the air, and the lead truck lurched sideways, smoke pouring from its hood. Training says you freeze for a half second, then act. I didn't freeze. Pull security. Second and third vehicles form perimeter. Get the wounded out now. My voice came out steady. Not because I wasn't scared, but because fear wastes time. Soldiers scrambled into position. I jumped out, grabbing a fire extinguisher, helping drag the driver clear while Morales covered us. The explosion had rattled my bones, but my brain was already calculating how many minutes until a secondary attack, how far to the alternate route, how much fuel we'd burn detouring. The driver coughed, bleeding from his forehead but alive. The radio crackled with static and tension. What's the call, ma'am? Alternate route Bravo, I said. Vehicle 3 takes point. Damaged truck gets towed back to the rally point. Everyone else, move. Now. No one argued. Orders are easy to follow when they make sense under fire. By the time the dust settled, we were rolling again. Slower but intact. The supplies made it to the base before nightfall. Command called it a success. I called it the bare minimum, doing the job so others could keep doing theirs. Back in the tent that night, I pulled off my boots and stared at the dirt caked on the laces. Morales handed me a cup of instant coffee, black and bitter. Not bad for a first run, he said. Not good enough either, I replied. He grinned. Welcome to the job. Letters from home kept arriving, though they might as well have been from another planet. Dad's notes stayed short. Proud of you. Stay safe. Mom didn't write. Charlotte sent a glossy photo of her in New York, standing on courthouse steps with a caption. The future looks good on me. I read it once, folded it, and used it as a bookmark in a field manual. Weeks blurred into missions. Convoys, airlifts, inventory checks. Every pallet mattered, every manifest had to be flawless. One missed line on a spreadsheet could mean no insulin at a clinic or no ammo at an outpost. People think war is fought with rifles. Sometimes it's fought with clipboards. I learned that quickly. One operation had us coordinating with Air Force crews to drop supplies into an isolated area cut off by flooding. The C-130 rumbled overhead, and I guided the drop zone team with hand signals, making sure the pallets landed where trucks could reach them. When the supplies hit the ground, soldiers cheered like it was Christmas morning. Nobody thanked me directly, but they didn't have to. I wasn't there for applause. In quieter moments, I thought about home. I wondered if Mom told her friends that one daughter was arguing cases while the other was still overseas somewhere, doing soldier stuff. I wondered if Charlotte mentioned me at all. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. Either way, I didn't exist in their stories except as a footnote. Fine. Out here, my work was more than a footnote. It was the difference between ready and ruined. One evening, Morales leaned back on a crate and said, "Why'd you sign up anyway? You don't strike me as someone who needed to prove toughness." "I didn't," I said. "I needed to prove capability. Big difference." "That, to who? Yourself?" "To everyone who assumed I'd never measure up." He didn't push after that. Some truths are self-explanatory. Toward the end of the deployment, we got word of a major push requiring double the usual supplies. The schedule was insane, the routes dangerous, but backing down wasn't an option. I coordinated with 3 units at once, slept maybe 4 hours across 2 days, and still made sure every truck carried what it needed. When the final convoy rolled out under cover of darkness, I stood by the gate counting vehicles. Morales walked up beside me. "You know," he said, "they'll never write your name in the history books for this." "I don't care," I answered. "I just want the numbers to add up." The trucks disappeared into the night, taillights glowing red against the desert. I checked my watch, noted the departure time, and filed it in my log. That was my history book. It didn't need a headline, just accuracy. When the deployment ended, we flew back stateside. Soldiers hugged their families, waved flags, cried into cell phones. I stepped off the plane with my duffel bag and saw Dad waiting, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the crowd until they found me. He smiled, a small but steady thing, and raised a hand. Mom wasn't there. Charlotte definitely wasn't. Dad shook my hand the same way he had at basic training graduation. "Glad you're home," he said. "Glad I made it back," I replied. He didn't ask for stories, and I didn't offer any. Some details belonged to the sand, the spreadsheets, and the soldiers who lived them. But I knew one thing for sure. I had measured up, whether my family acknowledged it or not. The dust from Iraq still sat in the seams of my boots as I carried them inside, ready for whatever came next. The boots still carried desert dust when I stepped into my new assignment stateside. Instead of convoys across Iraq, I was now at a logistics hub in Kentucky, surrounded by warehouses, forklifts, and computer screens glowing with inventory spreadsheets. It didn't look dangerous, but the stakes were just as high. Every shipment I approved fueled a battalion or stocked a hospital. Mistakes here didn't make noise, they just quietly wrecked missions. My promotion to logistics officer didn't come with confetti. It came with more responsibility and a sharper learning curve. The first briefing I led was a mess. PowerPoint slides froze, a sergeant interrupted me twice, and the lieutenant colonel in the back row looked unimpressed. I regrouped, scrapped the slides, and started talking through the convoy charts from memory. By the end, people were actually taking notes. Afterward, the colonel stopped me in the hallway. "You lost control at the start," he said. "But you got it back. Do that every time." "Yes, sir." The work itself was constant triage. Weather delays, broken trucks, shortages nobody wanted to admit until the last second. I learned how to anticipate failures before they showed up. At 2 a.m, I was the officer who walked through the warehouse with a clipboard, checking serial numbers while everyone else trusted the computer. If a pallet was miscounted, I caught it. Soldiers downrange didn't care about excuses, they cared about whether the right crate arrived when bullets were flying. Recognition came in small doses. One morning, a colonel handed me a commendation for coordinating a last-minute reroute that kept an entire brigade on schedule. I slipped it into my desk drawer and kept working. Later, I mailed a copy home, thinking maybe my parents would finally see it as proof. When Dad called, his voice was steady as ever. "Got your letter, congratulations." "Thanks. Did Mom see it?" "She did," he said carefully. "What did she say?" "That Charlotte just got invited to a networking dinner in D.C. and Crete." I laughed, short and sharp. Of course she did. Charlotte herself called a week later. Her tone was half bored, half smug. "I hear you got a medal or something." "A commendation," I corrected. "Right. That's nice. Anyway, I just closed a deal at the firm. Partners were impressed. Good for you." There was a pause, then she added, You're still not thinking this army thing is a career, are you? I could have explained the scope of what I managed. Multi-million-dollar supply lines, international coordination, hundreds of soldiers depending on my planning. Instead, I just said, "It's already a career, Charlotte." Her laugh was polite, dismissive. "Sure, if that's what you want to call it." I didn't bother arguing. Some walls weren't worth climbing. Months rolled into years, and the commendations stacked up. My team pulled off missions that didn't make headlines but saved lives all the same. We were the reason field hospitals had antibiotics and forward units had fuel. Nobody outside our circle noticed, but inside the army, people started asking for me by name. Another medal came after a hurricane response, when our unit delivered food and medical kits to towns cut off by flooding. Reporters covered the National Guard handing boxes to civilians, but none of them mentioned the planners behind the scenes. I didn't mind. Seeing kids with bottled water in their hands was enough. Still, when I went home on leave, the story didn't change. Mom asked if I was still stationed somewhere with a desk. Charlotte bragged about promotions and cocktail parties. Relatives patted my arm, saying it was so sweet that I was sticking with the army for now, like it was a hobby I'd eventually grow out of. At Thanksgiving, Uncle Ray asked if I was managing a supply closet. I told him I was managing distribution networks larger than most corporations. He blinked, then nodded the way you nod at a child with an overactive imagination. I stopped trying to correct them. Let them keep their version. My receipts were real, even if they lived in a drawer instead of on the fridge. Back on base, I found more validation in the faces of the soldiers who trusted me. When a shipment arrived on time after weeks of delays, a private once muttered, "Ma'am, you saved our asses." That was the kind of review I preferred. Late one night, Morales, now promoted himself, walked into my office and dropped a coffee on my desk. "You know," he said, "you've come a long way from that first convoy." End of. Still feel like I'm catching up, I admitted. "That's how you know you're doing it right." I sipped the bitter coffee, eyes on the glowing map of supply routes, and thought about how far from Texas I was, not just in miles but in everything that mattered. Approval wasn't coming from my family, not in the way they gave it to Charlotte. But I'd proven myself where it counted. The numbers added up, the missions held, and people kept moving forward because I made sure they could. The courthouse steps in Charlotte's holiday card looked polished enough to blind you. She stood in the photo wearing another tailored blazer, chin tilted like she'd conquered Wall Street single-handedly. The caption read, "Making moves in Manhattan." Mom put it front and center on the fridge. My commendation certificate, which Dad had mailed them a copy of, was nowhere to be seen. Phone calls with Charlotte were less conversations and more monologues. She talked about clients with vacation homes in the Hamptons, about dinners where senators just happened to drop by. When she did pause, it was usually to throw in a jab. "So Vic, you still wearing boots all day? Must be cozy compared to the boardroom." I kept my replies short. "Yeah, boots work fine." Mom, meanwhile, had turned Charlotte into the headline of every family gathering. On calls, she'd say, "Your sister's firm just gave her another bonus," or "Charlotte's flying to Europe for a case." When the topic swung to me, the phrasing softened. "Victoria's still serving. We're proud, of course, but you know how hard military life can be." The pause afterward said more than the words did. Dad never contradicted her out loud, but sometimes I'd catch the look in his eyes when he asked me about missions. He wanted details, proof, numbers. I gave him enough to satisfy without crossing lines I wasn't supposed to share. He nodded, absorbing it all, but he didn't tell Mom. That was his quiet rebellion. One holiday I managed to get leave and flew home. The house felt smaller, as if Charlotte's framed degrees had crowded out the walls. She had a new Lexus in the driveway, gleaming under the Texas Sunday. My rental sedan looked like an afterthought next to it. Dinner was a replay of every script I already knew. Charlotte dominated the table, with stories about depositions, courtroom victories, and partners fighting over her talents. Relatives leaned in, hanging on every word. When the spotlight turned my way, Mom jumped in before I could speak. "Vic's still in the army. She travels so much we barely keep up. Must be exhausting." Charlotte raised her wine glass with a smirk. "Well, at least she's not in any real danger. I read most of those logistics jobs are just spreadsheets and filing." Good for her, keeping busy. The table chuckled politely. I'd cut my turkey with precision and said nothing. Picking fights over cranberry sauce wasn't worth it. Later, as dishes clattered in the kitchen, I overheard my aunt ask Mom how she handled the stress of having one daughter in courtrooms and another in combat zones. Mom's reply was a knife disguised as concern. We just hope Victoria doesn't burn out. She means well, but honestly, thank God Charlotte turned out the way she did. Otherwise, we'd have no one to brag about. The words stung, not because they were new, but because they were so familiar. Same script, different night. Charlotte joined me on the porch after dessert, glass of wine in hand. You should think about your future, she said casually. You can't wear a uniform forever. At some point, you'll need a real career. I raised an eyebrow. What do you think I've been doing the past decade? Traveling, she said with a shrug. Playing soldier. It's fine, but it's not permanent. Law, now that's permanent. Her certainty was almost comical. I leaned against the railing, staring at the dark Texas sky. Charlotte, if the army disappeared tomorrow, half the systems you depend on would collapse within weeks. That's how permanent it island. She waved me off. You always exaggerate. Dad opened the screen door, stepping out just long enough to say, she doesn't exaggerate, before going back inside. That single sentence carried more weight than any toast Charlotte had ever given. Back on base a few weeks later, I buried myself in work. Missions demanded focus, not family politics. But the sting lingered. During a midnight run around the track, I thought about how my family talked as if I were one headline away from a memorial service. They never said it outright, but the tone was there. Thank God she's not dead yet. That was their bar for success. Charlotte's bar, meanwhile, was another zero on her paycheck. The contrast gnawed at me, but it also sharpened me. When younger soldiers complained about long hours, I reminded them what failure meant. When officers hesitated over decisions, I pushed forward with clarity. I refused to let anyone reduce me to a placeholder or a pity project. Recognition in uniform came slowly but steadily. New missions, new responsibilities, new people trusting me with their lives. Yet the calls from home stayed predictable. Mom bragged about Charlotte's firm making headlines in the business section. When she mentioned me, it was with a sigh. Victoria's still overseas. We pray she comes home safe. That was the box they'd built for me. The fragile one, the background character. I didn't bother trying to climb out of it anymore. I just kept building a different story, one they'd never bother to read, but one that mattered where it counted. The gap between us wasn't just miles, it was a chasm of perception. She had a family that clapped at every step she took, while I had silence or pity. But distance has a way of teaching you which applause is worth chasing. I stopped chasing theirs. On nights when the hum of generators filled the air and sand worked its way into every crease of my boots, I felt more grounded than I ever did in that Texas house. The army didn't need me to fit a role my family understood. It needed me to deliver, and I did. That was enough. The helicopter blades cut through the air as we descended into Afghanistan. From above, the terrain looked endless dust, rock, and villages, tucked between ridges like they were trying to hide from history. I was there for one reason, to keep people alive by making sure supplies got where they were needed. Guns and politics might have been what people saw on the news, but without logistics, none of it worked. Our assignment was brutal on paper. Establish a reliable airlift route into a valley that had been cut off by insurgent activity and flooding. Roads were unreliable, bridges destroyed, and locals desperate for medicine and food. If we didn't get the corridor open, people would die. I didn't care if they were wearing uniforms or not, my job was to move resources into impossible places. I set up shop in a drafty tent that smelled like diesel fuel and sand. Maps covered the walls, lines crisscrossing like veins. I had teams running calculations on flight loads, weather windows, and refueling points. C-17 seconds and C-130 seconds were lined up on the tarmac, waiting for orders. Every box mattered, every number had to match. During one planning session, Captain Riley shook his head at the charts. Ma'am, you're threading a needle that isn't there. Those ridges are too close for comfort. Comfort isn't on the list of objectives, I said. Survival island. And the only way they survive is if we get those planes through. The corridor stands. Riley muttered something about stubborn officers, but he started running the numbers again. The first flights went out at dawn. I stood at the edge of the runway, headset on, heart pounding as the engines roared. Watching those birds lift off felt like gambling everything on one roll of the dice. Minutes stretched into hours until the radio crackled. Cargo delivered, locals receiving supplies. No casualties. Relief washed over the team, but I barely had time to breathe before the next round of flights queued up. The air corridor had to stay open, and the enemy wasn't going to politely let us do our job. On the third day, reports came in of enemy fire near the valley. One transport nearly took a hit. The pilot's voice was calm, but I could hear the strain. "Recommend abort, ma'am. It's too hot." I scanned the map, weighing options in seconds. Negative. Adjust flight path 5 degrees west. Stay low through the ridge and keep moving. Ground teams are already in position. If we pull back now, they starve. There was silence, then a clipped, "Roger that." The plane made it through. So did the next one. When the dust settled, over 300 civilians and soldiers had received the supplies that kept them alive. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't newsworthy, but it mattered. That night, sitting on a folding chair with a stale protein bar, I finally let myself exhale. Morales, now attached to my unit again, dropped into the chair next to me. "You realize you just saved a few hundred people with a pen and a map," he said. "Maps don't fly planes," I replied. "Neither do starving people. Don't sell yourself short, ma'am." I didn't argue. Still, I kept most of it to myself. There were no phone calls home bragging about air corridors or pallets of insulin. Even if I tried, my family wouldn't have believed the scale of it. To them, logistics meant grocery store deliveries and clerical work. The words airlift corridor might as well have been in another language. When I finally rotated stateside for leave, the contrast was jarring. One week I was calculating fuel loads under mortar fire. The next I was back in Texas, sitting at Mom's kitchen table while she fussed over Charlotte's engagement ring. "Isn't it stunning?" Mom gushed, holding Charlotte's hand up so the diamond caught the light. "Her fiancé comes from such a good family. They've built everything themselves." "That's great," I said, sipping lukewarm coffee. Charlotte smirked. "What about you, Vic? Still playing with your spreadsheets overseas?" I could have told her that my spreadsheets just saved 300 people from starving to death. Instead, I shrugged. Something like that. Mom jumped in before I could add more. "We just worry, sweetheart. You're always gone, always in danger. It's not a real life. Charlotte's building a home, a future. You should think about that." I bit back the response that sat on my tongue. If I told them the truth, they'd dismiss it or twist it into something small. So I stayed quiet, letting them believe whatever narrative made them comfortable. After dinner, Dad cornered me in the garage while he was pretending to check the water heater. I read a short piece in the paper about an airlift in Afghanistan. Sounded like something you'd do. I met his eyes. He didn't ask directly, but I nodded once. He gave a small smile, the kind he used when balancing a spreadsheet finally worked out. "Good job." That was all. That was enough. When I flew back to base, the corridor was still holding. Supplies kept moving, lives kept hanging in the balance, and I kept signing off on manifests like a human metronome. Every delivery was another quiet victory nobody outside the wire would ever know about. The commendation came weeks later. Another ribbon, another line on a record. Command called me efficient. Morales called me a machine. I called it the job. The irony was that the harder I worked, the more invisible it all seemed at home. Charlotte's ring, her fiancé's resume, her law firm's press releases, those were trophies my family could display. My ribbons stayed in drawers. My stories stayed in tents. But I didn't need their stage. I had a war zone, a map, and people counting on me. That was more than enough. The promotion orders came through in the middle of a Tuesday briefing. I was officially a lieutenant colonel now. My team clapped. Morales cracked a joke about me finally being old enough for the gray hair that came with the rank, and I shook hands with the colonel who pinned the silver oak leaves to my uniform. Recognition in the army was practical, not sentimental. You got promoted because you delivered. Back home, it landed like a paper cut. I flew to Texas on leave, eager to breathe air that didn't smell like jet fuel and sand. Dad picked me up at the airport. He gave me his usual nod, one that carried pride even if he didn't wrap it in words. "Congrats, Colonel," he said. Lieutenant Colonel, I corrected. Still sounds good, he replied, and we both let it sit. At the house, Mom was already in motion. She ushered me in with a half hug before launching into a monologue about Charlotte's latest courtroom victory. She absolutely crushed opposing counsel. The judge said he'd never seen such poise from a young attorney. That's great, I said, dropping my duffel by the door. She didn't ask about the promotion. Dinner that night looked like a celebration for someone else's life. Charlotte had arrived early, wearing a dress that looked like it belonged on the cover of a legal magazine. Her fiancé, Ryan, was glued to her side, laughing too hard at her stories about high-stakes depositions. Mom beamed through it all. When the meal began, Charlotte barely looked at me. When she did, it was with the same smirk she'd been perfecting since we were kids. So, Vic, still doing your little army thing? I set my fork down. I was promoted to lieutenant colonel. There was a pause, short but sharp. Dad nodded once, approving. Mom tilted her head like she was trying to process foreign currency. Charlotte gave a polite clap with 2 fingers. Impressive, she said, tone flat. Though honestly, no offense, but what do you even talk about at those army dinners? Supply charts? Ryan chuckled, which was all the invitation she needed to keep going. Meanwhile, I've been invited to argue a case in federal court next month. Imagine the difference in audiences judges in New York versus soldiers staring at PowerPoints. I didn't rise to it. I cut into my chicken and let her monologue roll on. Later, as we sat in the living room, the conversation turned toward vacations. Charlotte detailed a planned trip to Italy with Ryan. Mom sighed about vineyards and Tuscan sunsets. Then someone, an aunt visiting from Dallas, asked about me. Do you get to travel anywhere nice? Charlotte answered before I could. Her travel is all deserts and tents. She doesn't exactly get frequent flyer miles. Lee. I leaned back in my chair. Germany wasn't bad. Bavaria has some good food. I was there opening a new facility. Charlotte blinked. Like a warehouse? Like a logistics hub that employs 1,500 people, I corrected. The room went quiet. Someone cleared their throat. Charlotte waved a hand dismissively. Still, not really a vacation spot. Mom changed the subject to keep the mood light, but the jab lingered. The next morning, Dad found me in the backyard sipping coffee. He sat beside me, watching the neighbor mow his lawn. You know, he said, I heard Charlotte last night. She doesn't mean it. She means it enough to say it, I replied. He nodded, not arguing. For what it's worth, I'm proud of you. Even if your mother doesn't know how to say it out loud. I appreciated it, but the silence from everyone else was louder than his words. At a family barbecue that weekend, the same pattern repeated. Relatives circled Charlotte, asking about her firm, her cases, her upcoming wedding. When they came to me, the questions were softer, more patronizing. So, still overseas? How long until you're done with that? Ever think about settling down? I answered politely, giving enough detail to shut down follow-ups. But inside, the gap widened. I'd just come from coordinating supply chains across continents, ensuring troops had what they needed in active war zones. Yet to my family, I was a curiosity at best. The breaking point came during dessert. Mom poured coffee, Charlotte raised her glass, and the conversation turned toward family updates. Charlotte went first, of course. She listed achievements like she was reciting a resume. New clients, bigger cases, a growing reputation in the city. Everyone clapped. Then she gestured toward me with her spoon. And then there's Vic. What are you even doing these days? I honestly don't know. You never have anything to share. I set down my cup carefully. I coordinate logistics for operations overseas. Recently Charlotte cut me off. So, spreadsheets. Got it. Laughter flickered around the table, nervous but present. That was when Dad spoke up. She's a lieutenant colonel now. You might want to show a little respect. Charlotte smirkled. I'm just saying, she never has any stories worth telling. It's all classified, right? So basically nothing. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable. It was heavy, cold, and suffocating. I excused myself and stepped outside. The evening air felt better than the living room. Standing there, I realized the truth. No matter what I achieved, my family had already written my role. Charlotte was the success. I was the background. And nothing, not even a silver oak leaf on my collar, would change the script they'd chosen. But I also knew something they didn't. Scripts only matter if you keep playing the part. I had stopped a long time ago. The invitation arrived in an envelope thick enough to double as a weapon. Gold trim, scripted font, the whole performance. Charlotte and Ryan were hosting their wedding at the Biltmore Hotel in Miami, a place with chandeliers that cost more than my yearly salary when I was a lieutenant. Mom called the day it came to make sure I understood the dress code. "Try not to look too severe in uniform," she said. "I wasn't planning on wearing it," I replied. "Good," she added, relief dripping through the line. "This isn't about the army. This is about family." Family, in her definition, meant Charlotte. When I flew into Miami, the humidity wrapped around me like a damp towel. At the hotel, a staff member handed me a garment bag labeled bridesmaid. Inside was a dress the color of old avocado and twice as unflattering. I raised an eyebrow. The other bridesmaids, Charlotte's friends from law school and Ryan's sister, had sleek navy gowns. Mine looked like a punishment. Charlotte breezed into the room while I was holding it up. "Isn't it perfect?" she asked, eyes gleaming. "It's something," I said. "I wanted you to stand out," she explained with faux sincerity. "Everyone knows you march to your own beat." I didn't bother arguing. She wanted me to look ridiculous, so I let her have her small victory. During hair and makeup, the other bridesmaids chatted about summer homes, internships, and European vacations. When someone asked about me, Charlotte jumped in. "Oh, Vic's in the army. She's been doing that for years. Stable work, I guess." "That." One of the bridesmaids smiled politely. "That must be steady." "Very steady," I said, sipping water. I didn't add that I had just returned from coordinating supply drops under fire. Details never mattered in these circles. They only wanted categories to file you under. The rehearsal dinner was a spectacle. White tablecloths, waiters in tuxedos, champagne flowing like they were auditioning for royalty. Ryan's family toasted to each other's achievements. Business deals, degrees, charitable foundations. When it was Charlotte's turn, she stood with Ryan's arm draped around her and said, "And of course, I'm grateful my little sister could make it all the way here. She's been busy with her army life. It's so different from what we do, but we love her for it." The applause was polite, detached. I smiled tightly, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. Later that night, while I slipped out for air, I caught Charlotte near the bar talking to Ryan's mother. "She's sweet," Charlotte said, her voice low but not low enough. "But you know, not really a role model type. We keep her involved so she feels included, but between us, Vic has never really found her place." Ryan's mother murmured something sympathetic, and they clinked glasses. I stepped back into the shadows before they saw me. My chest tightened, but not from surprise. She'd been rehearsing that narrative for years. Now she had a bigger stage. The morning of the wedding, chaos reigned. Photographers barked orders. Makeup artists touched up eyeliner. Coordinators whispered into headsets. I stood in the avocado green dress, bouquet in hand, while Charlotte preened in lace that had supposedly belonged to their grandmother. She looked radiant, I'll give her that. But radiance loses its shine when it's built on putting someone else in the dark. As the ceremony began, whispers floated down the aisle. Guests commented on the dresses, the flowers, the spectacle. When I walked past, I caught snippets. "That color doesn't suit her. Poor thing, Charlotte should have picked something else. She looks tired." I kept my face neutral. Soldiers learn early that endurance sometimes looks like silence. The vows were elaborate, the kiss theatrical, and the applause thunderous. Photographers herded us into formations like cattle. For every group shot, I was nudged slightly to the side, positioned so I wouldn't distract from the composition. At the reception, the ballroom glittered. Crystal chandeliers, an orchestra, food plated like artwork, guests clinked glasses, toasts flowed, and the spotlight never left Charlotte. She thrived under it, soaking in admiration like it was oxygen. When I approached the buffet, one of Ryan's uncles struck up conversation. "So, Charlotte tells me you're in the army. Supply or something?" "Logistics," I said. "Ah," he replied, clearly uninterested. "Important to keep things organized. My secretary says the same thing about our office." I gave a thin smile and let him wander back to the caviar. Throughout the evening, Charlotte paraded me past acquaintances, each introduction wrapped in the same bow. This is my sister, Victoria. She's in the army. Isn't that neat? Neat. Like a hobby, not a career. By dessert, I was tired of smiling through the condescension. I slipped onto the terrace, letting the humid night air replace the suffocating ballroom. Inside, I could still hear laughter, music, and my sister's voice carrying above the rest. For a moment, I leaned against the railing, looking out at the city lights. I thought about convoys, airlifts, and soldiers whose names never made the papers. I thought about the civilians in Afghanistan holding boxes of medicine we'd dropped from planes. And then I thought about Charlotte, standing under a chandelier telling the world I was an accessory to her narrative. The truth pressed against my chest like it wanted out. But instead of exploding, I stood there quietly, breathing in the Miami air. Some battles are fought with maps and manifests. Others are fought by letting people underestimate you until the right moment arrives. Behind me, the ballroom doors swung open, and the music grew louder again. The ballroom smelled of champagne and money. Waiters glided between tables with trays of hors d'oeuvres I couldn't pronounce, while a string quartet played the kind of music that made people sit straighter in their chairs. I slid into my assigned seat, the avocado green dress creasing awkwardly as I tried not to stand out more than I already did. Ryan's family filled the front tables, their conversations humming with stock prices, real estate, and Ivy League pedigrees. His father boomed about a construction project in Miami Beach. His mother mentioned a new judge appointment. His brother bragged about selling his tech company. Every sentence sounded rehearsed for maximum impact. When the spotlight turned to our side, Mom jumped in. "Charlotte has always been ambitious," she said proudly. "We're thrilled to see her match with such an accomplished family." Ryan's parents nodded politely, waiting for the obligatory counterbalance. That's when Charlotte leaned in with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "And this," she said, gesturing toward me, "is my sister, Victoria. She's been in the army for years now. Nothing glamorous, just logistics and paperwork, but it keeps her busy. And yous." The table chuckled politely, as if I'd been introduced as the quirky relative who collects stamps. I smiled tightly, setting my fork down before I snapped it in half. One of Ryan's cousins asked, "So, do you ever see combat?" Before I could answer, Charlotte waved a hand. "Oh no, nothing like that. She's always been behind the scenes. Safe and simple, right, Vic?" "Safe isn't the word I'd use," I said evenly. Ryan's mother tilted her head, curiosity creeping in. "What exactly do you do, dear?" "I make sure soldiers and civilians get what they need when they need it," I replied. "Food, medicine, fuel, equipment. Without it, nothing moves." Charlotte gave a light laugh. "So, grocery shopping on a bigger scale?" The table erupted in small, stifled giggles. I picked up my wine glass and took a sip, letting the sting of the alcohol burn away the urge to respond. Later, during the toasts, the disparity widened. Ryan's best man praised his entrepreneurial spirit. His father toasted the family legacy, and Charlotte's law partner praised her sharp mind and flawless work ethic. Then Ryan gestured toward our table. "To my new family," he said, raising his glass. "Judge Whitfield, who's dedicated her life to justice. Jason, who just sold his company for more money than most of us will ever see. And of course, my beautiful bride Charlotte, the brightest lawyer in New York." Applause thundered. Then his eyes swept across to me. "And to Victoria, who came all the way from, where was it?" "Seattle," Charlotte supplied. "Yes, Seattle," Ryan continued. "She works in Army logistics. Honest work and very important, even if not as flashy as law or business." The applause this time was softer, tinged with the pity you hear at funerals. A few guests gave me the kind of look you save for someone who just confessed they live in their parents' basement. I smiled again, because that was the only weapon allowed in this arena. As the night wore on, I found myself drifting to the edges of conversations. Ryan's family swapped stories of ski trips in Aspen and summers in the Hamptons. When someone asked about my travel, I almost said Kabul, Kandahar, Bavaria, but stopped myself. "Mostly work trips," I answered instead. They nodded politely and turned back to Charlotte's tales of courtroom drama. By dessert, the disdain had become background noise, like the clinking of silverware. Charlotte leaned over with a grin. "Don't take it the wrong way, Vic. Everyone knows you're doing your best. Not all of us are meant to shine in the spotlight." I met her gaze. Spotlights burn hot, Not everyone can stand under them without melting. Her smile flickered, but she recovered quickly. Always with the comebacks, she said, lifting her champagne flute. At least you keep things entertaining. Oud oudo. The band struck up another song. Couples moved onto the dance floor, and laughter rolled across the tables. I stayed seated, swirling what was left of my wine. The disdain in that room wasn't new. It was the same script I'd been cast in since childhood. But under the chandeliers and crystal glasses, it felt sharper, designed to cut. I set my glass down, stood, and walked toward the terrace doors. Inside, the music carried on. Outside, the air was thick and warm, the hum of traffic faint beneath the din of celebration. I leaned against the railing, letting the noise fade behind me, steadying my breathing. The night wasn't over, but I knew the performance inside had already written its judgment. Charlotte, the star, me, the footnote. I didn't argue. I let the judgment sit, because the truth has a way of arriving uninvited, and I was patient enough to wait for it. The terrace doors closed behind me, muting the orchestra to a dull hum. The night air in Miami clung to my skin, heavy with salt and heat. I stepped into the shadows near the potted palms, grateful for a moment of silence. Then voices drifted from the corner by the bar, sharp enough to slice through the buzz of the party. Charlotte's voice was unmistakable, pitched low but carrying. She's a burden, Ryan. Sweet, sure, but not dependable. You know I love her. But let's be real. Victoria's never been stable. My chest tightened, but I didn't move. Ryan's mother responded gently, as though weighing her words. Patricia mentioned wanting Victoria as godmother someday, but honestly, with her lifestyle, is that wise? Children need role models. Charlotte exhaled a laugh, the kind she used in court when dismantling a witness. Exactly. I've always been the one with ambition. Vic just floats. Mom and Dad send her money when she's short on rent. We all chip in for her car repairs. She's basically the family charity case. She means well, but she can't take care of herself, let alone a child. The words landed like body blows. I'd never asked for a dime from them. My car was old because I didn't care to trade it, not because I couldn't afford better. The charity case label wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a lie they'd all agreed on, a script written to keep me small. Ryan chuckled softly. Well, every family has one. At least she's harmless. Harmless. I gripped the railing to steady myself. My career, my soldiers, the missions that had saved lives all erased in a single phrase. To them, I was harmless background noise. Footsteps approached from the other side of the terrace. My cousin Derek's voice joined the chorus. Did you see her car out front? 15 years old, dented door. The valet looked embarrassed. I heard she's on food stamps. Oi. Another voice, one of Ryan's cousins, I think, replied. That's sad. She seems nice, though. She's clueless, Derek continued. Ignorance is bliss, I guess. She has no idea how far behind she's fallen. My stomach turned. Food stamps? I earned more than enough to buy a new car every year if I cared to. But in their story, I was a punchline. I pressed against the wall, letting the shadows keep me invisible. Their words looped in my head unstable, charity case, harmless, behind. Years of silence and downplaying my achievements had given them permission to invent an entire fiction about me. I thought back to Afghanistan, to the night we rerouted an airlift under fire. The crew had trusted me to make a call that saved 300 lives. And here, my own blood reduced me to a cautionary tale over cocktails. I turned from the voices, forcing slow breaths until the pounding in my ears settled. Then I pulled out my phone and typed a short message to Anthony Brooks, an old colleague who I knew was in Miami for a defense conference. Need a quick exit tonight. 10 minutes notice. Bring the SUV. His reply was immediate. Understood. I slid the phone back into my purse and straightened my shoulders. Going back inside felt like stepping into a courtroom where the verdict had already been read. But I refused to give Charlotte the satisfaction of my absence. Inside, the ballroom was brighter than ever. Charlotte and Ryan were on the dance floor, surrounded by guests clapping in rhythm. Mom hovered near the head table, basking in borrowed glory. Dad sat at the edge, half smiling, clearly exhausted by the performance. I slipped back into my seat just as another round of champagne was poured. Ryan tapped his glass, calling for attention. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. This celebration isn't just about Charlotte and me, it's about family. The room applauded. He continued, listing his parents' achievements, his brother's company sale, Charlotte's law career. Then his gaze shifted toward me. And of course, my new sister-in-law, Victoria. She's been with the army for some years now. Not everyone can be a surgeon or an attorney, but there's dignity in all work. She reminds us that simple paths still have value. Polite clapping followed. Guests turned to me with the same expressions people use at charity events, the ones meant to look kind but edged with pity. Charlotte leaned close and whispered, "Smile, Vic. They're applauding you." I smiled, but it wasn't for her. It was the smile of someone who had just seen the battlefield clearly. The orchestra struck up another song, and guests rose to dance again. I sat still, my hands folded, letting the laughter and music swirl around me. Betrayal wasn't new. What was new was hearing it so plainly, spoken aloud as if it were fact. And that clarity, sharp as glass, was enough to steady me. The clinking of silverware against crystal cut through the ballroom like a bell. Charlotte stood, flawless in her lace gown, holding her champagne flute high. Her smile had that courtroom precision practiced, controlled, and just sharp enough to cut skin. "First, thank you all for being here," she began, her voice carrying across the tables. "Ryan and I feel so lucky to celebrate with such accomplished, inspiring people. Family and friends who prove every day what success looks like." Applause rose around the room. She let it wash over her before continuing. "I want to toast my parents, who taught us ambition and drive. To Ryan's family, whose legacy speaks for itself. To my colleagues, who remind me that excellence is possible in every courtroom." She paused, scanning the crowd with a triumphant gleam in her eyes. Then her gaze found me. And of course, to my sister Victoria. Dozens of faces turned toward me. Charlotte's smile softened into mock affection. "Vic has always been unique," she said. "She chose a different path. Not law, not medicine, not business, something much simpler." A ripple of polite laughter. She went on. "She works in army logistics. Nothing glamorous, but honest work. It takes a special kind of person to stay content without chasing the spotlight. And though she may not have the flashy stories we've all heard tonight, she reminds us there's dignity in modest lives too." The applause that followed was thinner this time, scattered claps layered with sympathetic smiles. A woman across the table mouthed, "So sweet," like I was a child who'd just colored inside the lines. Charlotte raised her glass higher. To Victoria, proof that happiness doesn't require ambition. The toast hit harder than any battlefield explosion. I felt the weight of every pitying glance, every patronizing nod. Years of silence had allowed this caricature to grow unchecked, and now it stood in the center of a ballroom, validated by applause. I lifted my own glass, steady, unflinching. "Cheers," I said simply, taking a sip. The wine was dry, sharp on my tongue, but it grounded me. Around me, conversations restarted. Laughter resumed. Music swelled again. The insult had already been folded into the night, absorbed as entertainment. For them, it was just another story told over champagne. For me, it was confirmation of everything I'd overheard on the terrace. Ryan's uncle leaned across the table with a sympathetic smile. "She didn't mean it that way," he said, trying to smooth the edges. "She meant it exactly that way," I replied evenly. He blinked, caught off guard, and turned back to his plate. A few minutes later, a younger cousin approached shyly. "I think what you do sounds important," she whispered before scurrying back to her seat. It was the only genuine acknowledgement of the night, and it came from someone barely old enough to order a drink. Charlotte, meanwhile, glowed under the spotlight, moving from table to table, soaking up admiration. Every laugh at her jokes, every compliment about her dress, every handshake with Ryan's extended family added fuel to the performance. I stayed quiet, observing. Silence had always been their proof against me, proof that I was content, proof that I had nothing to add, proof that I belonged in the margins. But silence can also be strategy. Soldiers know when to conserve energy, when to bide time. As the band struck up another round of music, Charlotte returned to our table, flushed with victory. She leaned down toward me, voice sweet enough for those nearby to hear. "You were a good sport. I knew you wouldn't mind a little joke." I set my glass down carefully. "Of course, you've always loved a good punchline." She straightened, smile faltering for half a second before she turned to greet another guest. The rest of the evening blurred into a haze of clinking glasses and polished small talk. Guests continued to nod at me politely, their expressions dripping with pity disguised as kindness. In their eyes, I wasn't a lieutenant colonel who had coordinated missions under fire. I was the modest sister, the character in Charlotte's narrative who existed only to highlight her brilliance. I didn't correct them. Not yet. Correction without timing is wasted breath. Instead, I watched. I memorized faces, noted who laughed, who smirked, who looked away. Years in the army had taught me to study a room, to identify allies and liabilities. Tonight wasn't combat, but it was still a battlefield of perception, and Charlotte had fired the first shot in public. The orchestra swelled, couples danced, and servers cleared plates. I sat perfectly composed, every muscle steady, every smile calculated. To them, I was quiet, unremarkable, passive. To me, I was gathering data, the way I always did before making the right move at the right time. The toast had sealed their assumptions, but assumptions are fragile things. They hold until someone introduces facts sharp enough to shatter them. And I knew, sooner or later, those facts had a way of stepping into the room uninvited. The champagne glasses were still rattling from Charlotte's toast when the best man, Anthony Brooks, stood. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself like someone who'd spent too many years being listened to. He cleared his throat, and the noise in the ballroom quieted just enough. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, voice even but commanding, "but I need to borrow Lieutenant Colonel Hayes for a moment." The room stilled, conversations froze mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. The title hung in the air, colliding head-on with the narrative Charlotte had been spinning all night. Charlotte blinked, her smile faltering for the first time. "Excuse me?" Anthony's gaze didn't waver. "Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Hayes. The Pentagon needs her on a secure call. It can't wait." A murmur rippled through the tables. Guests leaned in, whispering, confusion spreading like spilled wine. Mom's face drained of color. "Lieutenant Colonel?" she repeated under her breath. Ryan chuckled nervously. "I think there must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," Anthony cut in, his tone flat, military. "I served under her in Afghanistan. When an entire valley was cut off by insurgents and flooding, she was the one who kept the air corridor open. Hundreds of people lived because she refused to quit. That's not a mistake. That's leadership." The room went silent again, the weight of his words pressing against the chandeliers. I rose slowly, adjusting the ugly avocado green dress like it was a uniform. "Thank you, Major Brooks," I said, my voice steady. Anthony nodded once, then stepped back, letting the silence work for me. All eyes turned toward me. The pity had evaporated, replaced by something closer to awe and discomfort. Even the orchestra had trailed off mid-note. Charlotte's voice broke through, brittle and sharp. "Vic, what the hell is going on? Why didn't you say—" "Because you never asked," I said. Her jaw snapped shut. I looked around the room, scanning the faces that had been so quick to smile sympathetically at me minutes earlier. You all were content with a version of me that didn't exist. A charity case. A burden. The sister who needed handouts. I've never taken a dime from any of you. Not once. But it was easier to believe that story than to hear the truth. Derek's face went pale, his wine glass shaking in his hand. "We didn't mean—" "You literally told people I was using food stamps," I interrupted, voice calm but cutting. "You said I was behind, that I was clueless, and none of you bothered to check if it was true. Why? Because you wanted it to be true. Because it made Charlotte look shinier." The guests shifted uncomfortably. Charlotte's fiancé stared at the floor. Anthony spoke again, his tone crisp. "If I may, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes has overseen supply chains larger than most corporations in this country. She's the reason soldiers on the front lines had rations, fuel, and medical supplies. She doesn't brag because she's too busy doing the work." Someone at the back gasped softly, followed by the unmistakable sound of a phone unlocking. Within seconds, whispers spread. "She's on Forbes. Is this real? 2 billion net worth?" Screens glowed around the room as guests Googled my name, the light from their phones reflecting disbelief. Charlotte's voice wavered. You told us you worked in food retail. I did, I replied evenly. I stocked shelves at Safeway while building my first distribution network from the ground up. I wanted to understand every link in the chain. When I said logistics, you smiled, nodded, and changed the subject. When I said supply management, you assumed I meant a storeroom. Mom finally found her voice, trembling. Why didn't you correct us? I tried once, I said. Uncle Richard patted my shoulder and said it was nice I was ambitious about grocery work. Aunt Susan congratulated me on running a department. After that, I stopped explaining. It was easier to let you believe your own story. The silence grew heavier. Even the clink of cutlery had stopped. I turned back to Charlotte. You've spent your whole life telling people I was the background character. Tonight, you stood here and toasted to my mediocrity like it was fact. But mediocrity doesn't build global supply systems. It doesn't earn the trust of soldiers under fire. And it sure as hell doesn't carry a silver oak leaf on its collar. Her face flushed red, the perfect bride cracking under the weight of exposure. Anthony checked his watch. Lieutenant Colonel, the SUV is waiting. The call's in 15 minutes. I nodded. Then I faced the room one last time. Here's the truth. Humility isn't invisibility. I don't need a spotlight to know my worth. And from now on, I won't let your version of me drown out the real one. Without another word, I stepped away from the table. The guests parted like water, phones still glowing, whispers chasing me to the exit. Behind me, the orchestra stumbled back into a song, but the notes sounded hollow in the wake of the revelation. Anthony held the door, his expression unreadable. Ma'am. Major? I replied and walked through. The lobby doors swung open, and the blast of humid Miami air hit me harder than the ballroom ever could. Outside, the government SUV idled at the curb, headlights cutting through the night. A uniformed driver stepped forward as Anthony walked just behind me, his presence solid, professional, a wall against whatever chaos buzzed in the ballroom above. Guests had spilled onto the hotel steps, whispering, craning their necks. Some clutched their phones, screens glowing with articles about my career, my rank, my company. A few tried to catch my eye with sudden admiration, the same people who'd looked at me with pity an hour earlier. I didn't give them the satisfaction. Anthony opened the door. Ma'am. I slid into the back seat, smoothing the avocado green dress as though it were a pressed uniform. Anthony followed, the door shutting with finality. The driver pulled away, leaving the glittering hotel behind in the rearview mirror. The ride was quiet, save for the low hum of the engine. Anthony finally spoke. That was something. They wrote their story years ago, I said flatly. Tonight, they got the ending they earned. Then, he nodded, respectful enough not to add anything unnecessary. We reached the secure facility where the call was waiting. The Pentagon line connected instantly, the familiar rhythm of strategy and urgency filling my ears. Supply routes, fuel shortages, contingencies in Eastern Europe. My mind clicked into place like a well-oiled machine, the insults and pity from the wedding dissolving into background noise. This was my real world, the one where competence wasn't optional, where lives depended on the details I managed. When the call ended, it was past midnight. Anthony glanced at me. Want to head straight to the hotel? No, I said. Take me to the office. I need to change. At headquarters, I stepped out of the SUV, handing the dress to my aide without a backward glance. Minutes later, I stood in full uniform, silver oak leaf gleaming under fluorescent lights. The weight of it on my shoulders felt right, balanced, earned. I walked into the operations center, where the night shift team looked up in surprise. They snapped to attention before I waved them down. Back to work, I said. Their trust and respect didn't come from titles or family trees, it came from every mission we'd survived together. By dawn, the Miami skyline stretched out beneath the rising sun, golden light bouncing off glass towers. I stepped onto the rooftop deck for a moment of air. From here, the ballroom and its whispers felt small, irrelevant. The city below pulsed with movement, with lives that didn't care about Charlotte's wedding or her curated reputation. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. Dozens of missed calls, texts piling up, Charlotte demanding explanations, Mom begging for a private conversation, relatives suddenly eager to understand my side. I powered it off without reading further. Silence was the only response they deserved. Later that morning, I joined a briefing at the Pentagon. The walls were lined with maps, charts, and officers who cared about outcomes, not narratives. When I entered, conversations hushed, then resumed with me folded seamlessly into the rhythm. I spoke, they listened. I gave orders, they moved. This was family, the kind built on competence, sacrifice, and unspoken respect. During a short break, one of the generals leaned over. "Hayes, you good?" "Never better," I said, and I meant it. I knew the whispers from the wedding would spread gossip, always traveled faster than truth, but for once I didn't care. My work was documented in operations reports, in lives saved, in missions completed. My legacy wasn't fragile enough to be undone by dinner table mockery. When the day finally slowed, I returned to my quarters, unbuttoning the uniform jacket with steady hands. The reflection in the mirror showed someone who had carried deserts, floods, and battlefields, someone who had been underestimated and dismissed but never broken. Charlotte would spin her version of events, as she always did. She'd tell friends that the night had been misunderstood, that I'd made a scene, that her toast was just a joke. Let her. She thrived on performance. I thrived on results. Walking away from that ballroom wasn't defeat. It was clarity. I didn't need to fight for space in a family that measured worth in applause and headlines. I already had a stage 1 where silence meant failure, where humility was strength, and where the consequences of my decisions were measured in lives, not likes. For the first time in years, I felt free of the weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. Free of chasing approval that was never coming. Free of trying to shrink myself so others could shine brighter. That night in Miami had stripped everything down to truth. I wasn't the family embarrassment. I was the standard they'd never bothered to see. And as I stepped back into the operations center, maps glowing across the walls, radios buzzing with voices from halfway around the world, I knew exactly who I was, Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Hayes, capable, proven, and stronger for having walked away. The days after the wedding came and went, but the sting of that night never followed me back into uniform. I had missions, schedules, and lives depending on me. I didn't waste time dissecting Charlotte's words or my mother's silence. Their version of me belonged to them, and it could stay there. What lingered was the clarity. For years I confused humility with invisibility. I thought keeping my head down, letting my work speak for itself, would eventually earn recognition. But people who don't want to see you will never notice the quiet. They'll fill the silence with whatever story makes them comfortable. My family wrote me in as a burden because it served their script. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not even bitter. I'm free. The truth isn't a secret, and it doesn't need defending. Those who matter already know it, and those who don't, never will. Walking out of that ballroom wasn't just leaving Charlotte's wedding, it was leaving behind years of carrying the weight of their judgment. I didn't need their applause, because I had something they couldn't manufacture with money, parties, or courtrooms. I had proof. Real proof, written in after-action reports, in names that went home alive, in systems that worked because I refused to let them fail. The irony is that the moment they finally saw me wasn't when I asked them to, but when the truth forced its way in. Maybe they'll remember it, maybe they'll bury it. Either way, I'll keep moving forward. Because family may write their own stories, but I've already written mine. And it doesn't end in pity. It ends in strength, clarity, and a freedom they'll never understand.